They sold him the ranch for $20. And that was the first sign something wasn't right. Because out here, nothing that cheap ever came without a story. But Elias Whitmore wasn't a man who chased stories anymore. He chased silence, the kind that settled into your bones after you'd lost enough to stop asking questions. In this place, 30 acres of dry grass and a leaning house with sun-bleached boards promised exactly that. No neighbors within 5 miles, no tracks in the dust but his own. Just wind slipping through broken fence posts and the low creak of wood that had seen too many seasons. The man who sold it barely met his eyes, just pushed the paper forward on the saloon table, a contract written in hurried ink. One line scratched in at the bottom like an afterthought. Elias noticed it. Of course he did. But he'd learned something about life out here. Sometimes reading too closely only made things harder to live with. So he signed, paid in cash, and rode out before sunset painted the sky the color of old rust. The house stood alone at the edge of what used to be Apache land, though no one in town liked to say that part out loud. Not anymore. They just called it abandoned, cursed if they were drunk enough. Elias didn't care what they called it. He cared that no one else wanted it. That was enough. His horse shifted uneasily as he tied it to the post, ears flicking toward the hills like it heard something Elias didn't. But horses were like that, always. Listening for ghosts men couldn't hear, Elias stepped onto the porch, boots pressing into wood that groaned under his weight. The door hung slightly open, moving just enough in the breeze to tap softly against the frame, steady, patient, like it had been waiting. Inside, the air smelled of dust and something older, something like smoke that had soaked into the walls long ago and never quite left. There wasn't much to see. A table, a chair, a bed frame missing half its slats, and hanging just above the doorway, a small object that didn't belong to the rest of the decay. A silver chain with a turquoise stone, clean, untouched by dust, catching the last light of day like it had something to say. Elias reached up, fingers brushing it lightly. It was warm, warmer than it should have been in the cooling air. He frowned but said nothing, just let it fall back against the wood. He'd seen stranger things out here, and most of them were better left alone. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it came that deep, stretching quiet that only exists where the land runs empty for miles. No voices, no wagons, just wind moving through grass in long, slow waves. Elias sat on the edge of the bed frame, hat low over his eyes, listening. Measuring the silence, it felt heavier here, thicker, like it pressed in from all sides. His horse stamped once outside, then again, restless. Elias glanced toward the door, but didn't move, settle. He muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he meant the horse or himself. Night came without ceremony, just a gradual fading of color until the world was shapes and shadows. Elias lay back, one arm over his chest, boots still on, a habit you don't lose when you've lived too long. Expecting trouble, the house creaked around him, not loud, not sudden, just the slow shifting of old wood remembering what it used to be. At some point, he closed his eyes, not fully asleep, just drifting in that space where thoughts come and go without asking permission. And somewhere in that drift, he thought he heard something, not a voice, not exactly, more like a presence, the faintest change in the air, like someone standing just beyond where sight could reach. He opened his eyes. The room was still, empty, the door unmoved, the pendant above it catching a thin line of moonlight. Elias stared at it for a long moment, then let his eyes close again. Morning came sharp and pale, the kind of light that shows every flaw instead of hiding it. Elias woke before the sun cleared the hills, same as always, years of routine carved too deep to change. He sat up slowly, joints stiff, mind already moving through the day ahead. Fence to fix, water to check, maybe ride into town if supplies ran low. Simple things, quiet things, the kind of life he'd chosen. He pushed himself to his feet, crossed the room, and pulled the door open. And that's when everything stopped, because she was there, kneeling in the dust just beyond the threshold, as still as the land itself, dark hair falling over her shoulders, hands resting lightly in her lap, the morning light catching the turquoise stone at her throat, the same shade as the pendant above his door. Her eyes lifted to meet his, steady, unafraid, and for a long second, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the grass behind her, carrying the scent of earth and distance. Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, not exactly. Something older, something he hadn't felt in a long time, recognition without understanding. She inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging something already decided, and then she spoke, her voice quiet, clear, carrying the weight of something far beyond the two of them. My father says I belong to you now. And just like that, the silence he had bought for $20 was gone. The words settled between them like dust that refused to fall, and Elias did not move, did not reach for his hat or step back. He just stood there in the doorway of a house he barely owned, looking at a woman who spoke as if a decision had already been made somewhere far beyond his understanding. The wind shifted, brushing past her shoulders, carrying the faint scent of sage and wood smoke, and still she did not lower her gaze. That is not how this works, Elias said finally, his voice low, steady, the kind of voice that had learned to stay calm even when the ground shifted under it. She tilted her head slightly, not confused, not offended, just observing, like she was listening to something deeper than the words themselves. It is how it was agreed, she replied, and there was no argument in her tone, no pleading, only certainty. Elias exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck, the morning sun climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the dry yard, making everything feel sharper, more real than he would have preferred. Agreed by who? He asked, and this time she looked past him, just for a moment, toward the open land beyond the house, as if measuring distance, or time, or something Elias could not see. By those who remember, she said, and then her eyes returned to his, steady again, unshaken. Elias felt a flicker of something he could not name, not fear, not yet, but close enough to make him aware of how quiet everything had become. Even the horse had stopped shifting, standing still by the post, ears forward, watching, as if it understood more than he did. Elias stepped aside from the doorway, just enough to break the line between them, not an invitation, not a rejection, just space. Stand up, he said, and she did, smooth and controlled, like she had done it 1,000 times, no hesitation, no stiffness from kneeling on hard ground, just a single motion that brought her to her full height. She was not small, not fragile. There was strength in the way she held herself, not loud, not demanding, just present, like the land itself. Elias noticed the pendant at her throat again, the turquoise catching the light in a way that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. What is your name? He asked, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite softness, but something that made her seem less like a figure placed there by fate, and more like a person standing in front of him. Nayeli, she said, the name settling into the air with a quiet weight. Elias nodded once. Elias, he replied, though he was not sure why. Names had not mattered much to him in a long time, but saying it now felt like placing something solid between them, something real. Nayeli glanced past him again, into the house, her eyes moving over the empty space, the worn table, the broken bed frame, the dust that had not yet settled into his ownership. You chose this place, she said, not as a question. Elias followed her gaze, then shrugged slightly. It was what I could afford, he answered, simple, direct, and she nodded, as if that explained more than he had intended. Silence returned, but it was different now, not empty, not comfortable, something in between, stretched tight like a rope waiting to see which way it would be pulled. Elias stepped back fully into the house, leaving the door open behind him. You are not staying out there, he said, not looking at her as he moved toward the table, brushing dust aside with his hand, making space that had not existed before. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then he heard her steps on the wood, light, controlled, each one placed with care. She crossed the threshold without hesitation, and for a moment, the pendant above the door swayed slightly, though there was no wind inside. Elias noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but said nothing. Nayeli stopped just inside, taking in the space again, her gaze moving slowly, deliberately, as if reading the room the way others might read a map. This house remembers, she said quietly. Elias let out a short breath that might have been a laugh in another life. It can remember whatever it wants, he replied. It is mine now. But even as he said it, the words felt less certain than they should have. Nayeli turned toward him, studying him in a way that made him feel like he was the one being measured now. Not the house, not the land, but him. Nothing here belongs to only one person, she said, and there was no challenge in it, just a statement. Elias leaned back against the table, crossing his arms loosely, trying to ground himself in something familiar, something that made sense. Listen, he said, choosing his words carefully. I do not know what your father thinks he agreed to, and I do not know what the man in town forgot to tell me. But I do know this. He met her eyes, steady, firm. You are not something that comes with land, and I am not a man who takes people as part of a deal. The words hung there, clear, unshaken, and for a moment, the air seemed to still around them. Nayeli did not look surprised, did not look relieved. She simply watched him, as if waiting to see what he would do next, not what he would say. And that was when Elias realized something that made his chest tighten slightly. This was not about what had already been decided. It was about what he would choose now. And somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet, empty house, the land was listening. The silence did not break. It stretched, deepened, until even the smallest sound seemed to carry weight. The faint creak of wood, the slow shift of Elias breathing, the almost imperceptible movement of the pendant above the door swaying once and then settling again. And Nayeli stood there as if she had all the time in the world, as if waiting was not a burden but a kind of knowing. Elias pushed himself off the table, restless now, not from fear but from something harder to place, something that felt like being watched by more than just the woman in front of him. He stepped toward the doorway, glancing out across the open land. Nothing moved, no riders, no dust trails, just miles of quiet earth stretching into the distance. But the quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, like a held breath. He narrowed his eyes slightly, scanning the ridgeline, the low brush, the places where shadows could hide shape and meaning. And still he saw nothing. But that did not ease the feeling. Behind him, Nayeli had not moved. He could feel it without turning. The steadiness of her presence like a fixed point in a shifting world. If someone sent you here, he said, still looking outward, they knew I would not turn you away. It was not a question, it was an observation, one that seemed to settle into the air between them. Nayeli's voice came softly, but it carried. They knew you would choose. Elias let out a slow breath through his nose, almost a humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. That is a dangerous thing to assume about a man, he said, finally turning back inside. She met his gaze again, unshaken. It is not assumption, she replied. It is memory. The word lingered, and Elias felt that same flicker again, that sense that something larger was moving just beyond the edge of his understanding. He stepped closer now, not threatening, not cautious, just closing the distance enough to see her clearly. The fine dust on her boots, the faint lines on her hands that spoke of work, not weakness. The way the turquoise stone at her throat seemed to catch light even when he shifted slightly out of its path. What does that mean? He asked, quieter now. And for a moment, Nayeli looked past him again, but this time not toward the land, toward the pendant above the door, her eyes resting on it with a familiarity that made Elias follow her gaze. That should not be here, she said, almost to herself. Elias frowned, stepping back slightly to look at it more closely. It was here when I arrived, he said. Just another thing left behind. Nayeli shook her head slowly, stepping forward until she stood beneath it, close enough that the light touched both the stone above and the one at her throat at the same time. The two pieces catching and reflecting in a way that felt deliberate, connected. It was not left behind, she said, her voice firmer now. It was placed. Elias watched her, the certainty in her tone cutting through the uncertainty that had been building in him since sunrise. By who? He asked again, and this time, she did not answer right away. Instead, she reached up, slowly, not touching the pendant, just letting her hand hover beneath it, as if feeling something unseen. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a change in pressure before a storm. Elias felt it on his skin, that same awareness that had woken him in the night. My grandmother wore one like this, Nayeli said finally, her voice softer now, carrying something that had not been there before, something closer to memory than statement. She said it marked a place where promises were kept, even when people forgot them, Elias leaned slightly against the doorframe, arms loose at his sides, listening despite himself. "And what kind of promises are we talking about?" he asked, and Nayeli lowered her hand, turning back to face him fully. "The kind that do not belong to one side," she said. "The kind that bind two people whether they understand it or not." The words settled deep, and Elias felt that tightening again, not from fear, but from recognition, not of the situation, but of the weight behind it. He had seen men make promises out here, had seen what happened when those promises were broken, land taken, trust lost, silence left in its place. He had chosen that silence, built his life around it, and now it stood in front of him in the shape of a woman who spoke as if silence was not an ending, but a beginning. "You keep talking like this was decided before I ever set foot here," he said, his voice steady but quieter now, and Nayeli nodded once. "It was," she answered, simple, direct. Elias let the words sit, did not push back right away, did not dismiss them like he might have the day before. Something in him had shifted, not enough to accept, but enough to listen. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, moving through the grass in long, slow waves. And for just a moment, Elias thought he saw something at the edge of the far ridge, not a figure, not clearly, just a presence, like the land itself was watching. He blinked, and it was gone, or maybe it had never been there at all. He looked back at Nayeli, who had not turned, had not reacted, as if she did not need to see it to know it was there. "If this is some kind of arrangement," he said, choosing his words carefully now, "then it is one I have not agreed to." Nayeli studied him, her expression unreadable but not cold, not distant, just present. "Not yet," she said, and the way she said it made it clear she was not correcting him. She was waiting. The room seemed to hold that moment, stretching it just long enough for Elias to feel the weight of what came next, because for the first time since he stepped onto that land, he understood something he could not ignore. This was not about what had been written on a piece of paper in a saloon. It was about a choice that had not been made yet, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the silence he thought he had bought, that choice was already being witnessed. The air did not move, yet something had changed, as if the land itself had leaned closer to listen, and Elias stood there, feeling it settle into his chest, not heavy, not yet, but undeniable, like a weight that had chosen him instead of the other way around. He turned slowly toward the open doorway again, needing space, needing something that made sense. But the yard outside looked different now, not in shape or color, but in meaning. Every fence post, every stretch of dry grass felt like it belonged to a story he had just stepped into without knowing the first chapter. His horse shifted again, this time letting out a low breath. Not fear, just awareness. Elias stepped onto the porch, boots pressing into the worn wood, the sun now higher, warming the ground, but not easing the tension that had taken root. He scanned the horizon once more, slower this time, not searching for riders, but for anything that might explain what he could not see. The ridgeline sat quiet, the distant hills unchanged, and yet the silence felt occupied, like a room filled with people who chose not to speak. Behind him, he heard Nayeli step closer, her presence steady, unhurried. She did not crowd him, did not try to lead. She simply stood where she needed to be. "They are already here," she said quietly, and Elias did not turn right away. He let the words sit, measuring them against the empty land in front of him. "I do not see anyone," he answered, and there was no challenge in it, just truth as he understood it. Nayeli did not argue. "You are not meant to," she replied, and something in her tone made him finally glance back at her. She was watching the horizon, but not with her eyes alone. There was a stillness in her that felt like listening, deeper than sound. Elias leaned one hand against the porch post, grounding himself. "Then what are they waiting for?" he asked, and this time, she looked at him, directly. "For you," she said. Simple as that. The words settled in a way that left no space to step. Around them, Elias let out a slow breath, running his thumb along the rough wood of the post. "I have not done anything," he said, more to himself than to her, and Nayeli shook her head slightly. "Not yet," she repeated, the same words, but now they carried more weight, because he was beginning to understand what they meant. This was not about something he had done, it was about something he would choose to do, and the land, the people tied to it. were waiting to see which way that choice would fall. Elias straightened, pushing himself off the post, a decision forming, not fully shaped, but enough to move. "I am going into town," he said, turning back toward the house to grab his hat from the table. "If there is something behind this, it started there." Nayeli did not follow immediately, but her voice came from behind him, calm, certain. "They will expect that." Elias paused just inside the doorway, hat in hand. "Good," he replied, placing it on his head. "Then they can explain it." He stepped back out, moving toward his horse, checking the saddle strap out of habit more than necessity, his hands steady even as his thoughts shifted beneath the surface. Nayeli stepped onto the porch now, watching him without interruption. "If you go," she said, "you do not go alone." Elias gave a small shake of his head, tightening the strap. "I have been alone a long time," he answered. "I know how to ride into town." Nayeli did not argue, but she stepped down from the porch anyway, closing the distance between them with the same quiet certainty she carried in everything she did. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the reflection of the sky in the turquoise at her throat. "That is not what I meant," she said, and Elias paused, his hand still on the saddle, looking at her, really looking this time, seeing not just the presence, not just the calm, but the awareness behind it, the understanding that reached further than his own. "Then say it plain," he replied, and she held his gaze, steady, unblinking. "Where you go, they will follow," she said. "Not to stop you, not to harm you, but to witness." The word landed differently now, heavier, clearer. Elias let out a breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Witness what?" he asked, and Nayeli did not hesitate. "Whether you are the man they believe you are." Elias looked away for a moment, toward the open land, the endless stretch of it that had once meant freedom, and now felt like a question waiting for an answer. He swung himself up onto the saddle in one smooth motion, settling into it like something familiar in the middle of everything that was not. He looked down at her. "And what kind of man do they think I am?" he asked, and Nayeli's expression did not change, but something in her eyes deepened. "One who does not take what is not his," she said. And then, after a brief pause, "Even when the world tells him he can." The words stayed with him as he turned the horse toward the path leading into town, the dust shifting under its hooves, the rhythm steady, grounding, but the quiet behind him did not fade. It stretched, followed, unseen but present, and as Elias rode away from the house he had bought for almost nothing, he understood something that settled deeper than any doubt. Whatever waited in that town, whatever truth sat behind a cheap contract and a forgotten line of ink, it was not going to be about land or money. It was going to be about him, and somewhere beyond sight, beyond sound, that answer was already being watched. The road into town stretched long and pale under the rising sun, dust lifting in slow curls beneath the horse's hooves, each step steady, measured, but Elias could feel it now, that presence behind him, not close enough to see, not loud enough to hear, but there, like a shadow that did not belong to the body casting it. He did not turn around. Not yet. Some instincts were older than thought, and this one told him that looking too soon would not change anything. The land rolled gently on either side, dry grass bending in the breeze, distant hills holding their silence like they always had, and yet nothing felt the same as it had the day before. He adjusted his grip on the reins, jaw set, eyes forward. The town sat about 5 miles ahead, a cluster of buildings that had once meant trade, noise, and human certainty. Now it felt like a place that held answers he was not sure he wanted. The rhythm of the ride settled into him, hooves striking earth, leather creaking, wind brushing past his coat, familiar things, grounding things, but beneath it all, that awareness stayed, patient, waiting, as if whatever followed did not need to hurry, because it already knew where he was going. By the time the first rooftops came into view, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning chill, heat rising from the ground. In wavering lines, Elias slowed the horse slightly, taking in the scene ahead. Nothing looked out of place. A wagon parked near the general store, a couple of men standing outside the saloon, talking low, hats tipped against the light. Ordinary. But as he rode closer, something shifted, not in the town, but in the way it received him. Conversations paused, not abruptly, not enough to draw attention, just enough that he felt the absence of sound where it should have been. A door closed a little. Too quickly. A glance held a second longer than usual. Elias guided the horse down the main stretch, boots brushing lightly against its sides, posture relaxed. But his eyes missed nothing. He stopped in front of the saloon, tying the reins to the post, the wood warm under his hand, worn smooth from years of the same motion. He stepped inside. The air cooler, thick with the scent of old wood and coffee. A few men sat at the tables, none of them speaking now, the kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from waiting. Elias removed his hat slowly, brushing dust from the brim, then placed it on the bar. The man behind it, Carter Bell, looked up, his face composed, but his eyes gave him away. There was something there. Something like recognition mixed with something harder to name. "Morning," Elias said, his voice even. Carter nodded once, wiping his hands on a cloth that did not need it. "You made it back sooner than I expected," he replied, and there it was, the first crack in the ordinary. Elias rested his forearms lightly on the bar, leaning in just enough to close the distance. "You sold me a place yesterday," he said. No accusation in his tone, just fact. Carter's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to Elias. "That I did," he answered. Elias held his eyes steady. There was something missing from that conversation. Carter exhaled slowly, setting the cloth down, his movements careful now, measured, like a man choosing each step across uncertain ground. "There was something you did not ask," he replied. Elias let that sit for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then I am asking now," he said. "What exactly did I buy?" The room held its breath, the men at the tables not looking, but listening. All the same, Carter glanced again toward the door, then back at Elias, lowering his voice just enough that it did not carry beyond the bar. "That land," he began, "was not just land." Elias did not move, did not react, just waited. Carter continued. "It was part of an agreement, one that was made a long time ago, before most of us were even born." Elias felt something settle in his chest. The pieces starting to take shape, not fully, but enough to see the outline. "Between who?" he asked, and Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "Between the people who built this town," he said, "and the ones who were here before it." Elias straightened just a fraction. "And that agreement includes sending a woman to my door and telling her she belongs to me." Carter's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no avoidance in them, just something close to regret. "It includes honoring what was promised," he said, "in whatever form that promise takes." Elias let out a slow breath, running his thumb along the edge of the bar, feeling the grooves worn into it over years of hands just like his. "You could have told me," he said quietly. Carter nodded. "I could have," he admitted, "but then you would have walked away." The truth of it hung there, simple, unadorned. Elias did not deny it, because he knew it was true. "So you let me walk into it blind," he said. Carter shook his head slightly. "Not blind," he replied. "Just unprepared." Elias gave a small, humorless smile. "That is one way to put it," he said. Then his expression settled again, serious, grounded. "She is not staying because of some old agreement," he added, his voice firm now. "Not unless she chooses to." Carter studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in his face. Not surprise, not quite approval, but recognition, like a man seeing something confirmed that he had only suspected before. "Then it seems," Carter said slowly, "that the agreement might not be about ownership at all." Elias frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, and Carter leaned in just a fraction, lowering his voice even further. "I mean," he said, "that some promises are not meant to give one person power over another." He paused, letting the words settle. "They are meant to reveal what kind of man you are when you are given that chance." Elias held his gaze, the weight of those words sinking in deeper than anything else that had been said. Outside, the wind moved through the street, carrying dust in slow, deliberate patterns, and somewhere beyond the edges of town, beyond sight, beyond sound, the same presence that had followed him here remained, waiting, not for the past to be explained, but for the present to be chosen. The words did not leave Elias when he stepped back out into the sun. They followed him like dust clinging to his coat, settling into the spaces between his thoughts, and for a moment he just stood there beside the horse, one hand resting on the saddle, eyes drifting across the street as if seeing it. For the first time, the town had not changed, but something in him had. The way he measured things, the way he weighed silence against truth, he could still feel the eyes on him. Not hostile, not welcoming, just waiting. The same kind of waiting he had felt out on the land. Only here it wore the shape of people instead of distance. He exhaled slowly and pulled himself into the saddle. The motion automatic, familiar, but the purpose behind it no longer simple. He did not linger, did not offer any more words. He turned the horse back toward the open road, leaving the town with the same quiet he had arrived with, but not the same certainty. The ride back felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because his mind no longer moved with the rhythm of the horse. It moved ahead, circling the words Carter had spoken: agreement, promise, choice. They did not fit neatly together, not in the way contracts and fences did. They belonged to something less visible, something that could not be measured in acres or dollars. The wind picked up as he cleared the last building, carrying with it that same sense of presence. And this time, Elias did not ignore it. He let it sit beside him as he rode, not chasing it, not denying it, just acknowledging that it was there. The land stretched out before him, wide and open, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like it was watching, like it had always been watching, waiting for someone to understand what had been placed in front of them. When the house came into view again, small against the vastness, Elias slowed the horse, his gaze settling on the porch. Nayeli stood there, exactly where he had left her, as if time had not moved for her the way it had for him. Her posture unchanged, calm, steady, but her eyes followed him long before he reached the fence, as if she had known the moment he turned back. Elias dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He tied the reins without looking, his attention fixed on her, on the quiet certainty she carried like it was something real you could hold. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet from the porch. "They told me enough," he said, his voice low, not defensive, not accusing, just stating what had been learned. Nayeli inclined her head slightly. "And what did you hear?" she asked. Elias glanced briefly toward the horizon behind her, then back. "That this land was part of something older than any of us," he said, "and that I was never meant to understand it before I stepped into it." Nayeli watched him, the faintest shift in her expression suggesting that he was closer to something than he had been before. "And now," she said. Elias let out a breath, slower. This time, more deliberate. "Now I understand that it is not about what I bought," he replied. "It is about what I choose to do with what came with it." The words settled between them, and for the first time since morning, the tension in the air shifted, not gone, but different, like something had been acknowledged that could no longer be ignored. Nayeli stepped down from the porch, closing the distance by one step, not more, not pressing, just enough to stand on equal ground. "Then you understand the most important part," she said. Elias studied her, searching for something he could hold on to, something certain. "And what part is that?" he asked. Nayeli held his gaze, steady as ever. "That I am not here because I was given," she said. "I am here because this moment was." Elias frowned slightly. The words not simple, but not unclear either. They pointed to something he could feel, but not yet name. He shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the house, toward the doorway, where the pendant still hung, catching the light in a way that seemed almost intentional. "That pendant," he said, nodding toward it. "You said it was placed, not left." Nayeli followed his gaze, her eyes softening just a fraction. "It marks where two paths meet," she said, "not to force them together, but to see if they will choose to walk side by side." Elias looked at it again, really looked this time, not as an object, but as something that held meaning beyond itself. And for a moment, he felt the weight of that meaning settle into him, not heavy, but undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting for him to notice it. He turned back to Nayeli, the question already forming. "And if they do not?" he asked. Nayeli did not hesitate. "Then they part," she said simply, "and nothing binds them." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing that, the simplicity of it cutting through the complexity that had built around him since dawn. He took a step forward, closing the distance just enough that the space between them no longer felt like a line, but a choice. "Then hear this clearly," he said, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper now. You are not bound to me, not by land, not by any promise made before I was here. Nayeli did not interrupt, did not react outwardly. She simply listened. If you stay, Elias continued, it will be because you choose to stay, not because anyone told you that you belong to me. The words hung in the air, clear, unshaken, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The wind, the land, the unseen presence beyond the hills, all of it quiet. Waiting, Nayeli held his gaze, and then, slowly, something changed, not in her posture, not in her stance, but in her eyes. A depth that had been there from the beginning shifted, softened just enough to reveal something beneath the certainty, something closer to understanding. Then the choice is yours as well, she said, and the way she said it made Elias realize something he had not fully grasped until that moment. This was never only about whether she would stay, it was about whether he would allow her to stay as something equal, not owned, not owed, but chosen. And somewhere beyond the edges of the land, beyond what either of them could see, the presence that had followed him from the moment he signed that paper remained, no longer waiting for explanation, but for the quiet, simple truth that only a man's choice could reveal. The space between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a line drawn in the dust, not by force, but by choice, and Elias stood there, aware that stepping forward or stepping back would mean something now, something that could not be undone or ignored. The wind moved softly across the land, brushing past the house, stirring the edges of his coat, carrying with it that same quiet presence that had followed him since morning. But it no longer felt like pressure. It felt like witness, patient, unhurried. Nayeli did not move, did not look away. She simply stood in that space with him, as if she had always known it would come to this moment, where words had already been spoken and only actions remained. Elias glanced toward the doorway again, toward the pendant that swayed almost imperceptibly in the light, its turquoise catching the sun in a way that seemed almost alive. He stepped past her without speaking, moving into the house with a slow, deliberate pace, not avoiding her, not dismissing what had been said, but needing to see something clearly before he answered in any way that mattered. The boards creaked under his boots as he crossed the room, the familiar emptiness now holding a different weight, as if the house itself had shifted from shelter to something else entirely, something that held meaning beyond walls and roof. He stopped beneath the pendant, looking up at it, studying the way the silver chain held the stone, the way it had remained untouched by dust or time. You said this marks a place where two paths meet, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the porch. Nayeli stepped inside behind him, her presence quiet but certain. Yes, she replied. Elias reached up slowly, fingers brushing the stone this time, and again it felt warm, not from the sun, but from something deeper, something that made his hand pause for just a moment before lowering it again. He turned to face her, the question already forming into something more than curiosity. And who decides if those paths walk together? He asked. Nayeli did not hesitate. They do, she said, and her gaze held his, steady and unwavering. Elias let out a slow breath, nodding once, as if something had settled into place, not fully understood, but accepted in the way a man accepts the weight of a tool he has not yet used. He moved toward the table, brushing aside the remaining dust with the flat of his hand, clearing a space that had not existed before, a small, simple act, but one that carried more meaning now than it would have the day before. He gestured toward it, not a command, not an invitation spoken aloud, just a space made visible. Nayeli watched the motion, her eyes following the line of his hand, and for the first time, she moved without waiting, stepping forward, crossing that invisible line between them. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table, not claiming it, not testing it, simply acknowledging it. Elias met her eyes again, and this time, there was no distance left to measure, only the weight of what had already been chosen. You can stay, he said, the words simple, direct, but grounded in something deeper than obligation or agreement. Nayeli did not answer right away. She studied him, not searching for doubt, not questioning his intent, but recognizing something in the way he said it, something that did not need to be spoken twice. Outside, the wind shifted again, stronger this time, moving across the land in a way that carried a sense of release, as if something had been waiting for that exact moment, that exact choice, to be made. Elias felt it, not as pressure, but as a lifting, a quiet easing of something that had been held too tight. Naeli's hand moved slightly on the table, her fingers tracing the worn wood as if reading a story written long before either of them had arrived. "Then I will stay," she said, her voice calm, certain, but now there was something else beneath it, something that had not been there before, something closer to trust than obligation. Elias nodded once, not smiling, not reacting outwardly, but something in his posture shifted, a tension he had carried without noticing easing just enough to make room for something new, something uncertain, but not unwelcome. He stepped back slightly, giving her space that no longer felt like distance. The house seemed quieter now, not empty, not tense, just still in a different way, like a place that had finally settled into its purpose. The pendant above the door swayed once more, catching the light in a brief flash that faded as quickly as it appeared, and outside, beyond the reach of sight, beyond the edges of what either of them could see, the presence that had followed Elias from the moment he signed his name began to recede, not leaving, but stepping back, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. And in that quiet, in that simple, unspoken shift, something had changed, not in the land, not in the house, but in the man who had chosen to stand inside it and say no to ownership, and yes to something far harder to carry, something that could not be written into any contract, only live. The quiet that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like the first breath after something long held finally let go, and Elias stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just listening to the way the house had changed. The creak of the boards no longer sounded empty. The air no longer felt still in a way that pressed against him. It moved now, lightly, as if the space itself had accepted something it had been waiting for. Naeli remained by the table, her hand resting on the worn wood, her gaze drifting slowly across the room, not searching, not measuring, simply seeing, and that difference was not lost on Elias. He turned slightly, glancing toward the doorway where the pendant still hung, the turquoise stone now still, no longer catching the light with that sharp insistence it had before. It looked almost ordinary now, just an object, and yet he knew better than to think it had lost its meaning. Some things did not need to move to hold their weight. "This place will need work," he said finally, his voice low, grounded again in something practical, something he understood. Naeli nodded once. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no distance, just agreement. Elias stepped toward the window, pushing it open with a slow motion, letting the outside air move through the room more freely, the scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth filling the space, blending with the faint trace of smoke that had never quite left the walls. "There is a well, about 100 yards east," he said, gesturing loosely with his hand. "Water is low, but it will hold for now." Naeli listened, her attention steady. "And the fence along the north side is broken in 3 places," he continued, more to himself than to her. But the words felt different now, not like a man planning his day alone, but like something shared, even if only in the quiet way of presence. Naeli stepped closer to the window, standing just beside him, not touching, not crowding, just close enough that the space between them no longer felt like separation. She followed his gaze out across the land, her eyes moving over the distant lines of fence, the slight dip where the well sat, the uneven stretch of ground where the wind had worn it down over time. "It can be repaired," she said, and the way she said it carried more than just the obvious meaning. Elias glanced at her briefly, then back out, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close. "Most things can," he replied. The two of them stood there in that shared view, the land stretching out before them, no longer just his, not hers, but something in between, something that existed because both of them now stood within it. The moment lingered. Not long, not heavy, just enough to settle into something real. Then Elias stepped back, turning toward the door. "I will check the fence," he said, reaching for his hat again. The motion familiar, steady. Naeli did not stop him, but she moved as well, following him to the doorway, not to leave, but to stand there as he stepped out, watching the way he moved across the yard, The way his shoulders carried less weight than they had that morning. The way his steps were no longer measured against silence, but against something that had begun to grow in its place. Elias paused at the edge of the porch, glancing back once, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness. Nayeli stood in the doorway, the light framing her in a way that made her seem both part of the house and something beyond it. And for a brief moment, their eyes met again. No words passed between them. None were needed. Then he turned and walked toward the fence line, boots pressing into the dust, each step steady, grounded. The work ahead clear in his mind, the kind of work that could be seen, touched, fixed, and yet beneath it all, something else moved, quieter, deeper, the understanding that not everything could be repaired with hands and tools. Some things required something else entirely, something he had not named before. Back at the house, Nayeli stepped out onto the porch, her gaze following him for a moment before shifting outward, beyond the fence, beyond the visible land, toward the ridgeline where the presence had once been strongest. She stood there, still, listening, and though nothing moved, though no figure appeared, there was a sense of change, not absence, but distance, as if whatever had been watching had stepped back just enough to allow what had begun here to unfold on its own. She lowered her gaze slowly, turning back toward the house, stepping inside with a quiet certainty, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as she passed beneath the pendant, the turquoise stone catching a final glint of light before settling once more into stillness. And in that small, almost unnoticed motion, something had been marked, not as an end, but as a beginning that would not announce itself loudly, would not demand attention, but would grow in the quiet spaces between words, between choices, between two people who had stepped into something neither of them had planned and chosen, in their own way, to stay. The sun had climbed high by the time Elias reached the broken stretch of fence, the wood posts leaning at uneven angles, wire slack and half buried in dust, the kind of work he had done 100 times before without thinking. But today his hands moved slower, not from hesitation, but from awareness, each motion deliberate, each knot tied with a steadiness that came from more than habit. He pulled the wire taut, testing it with a firm grip, the metal humming faintly under tension, a sound that carried through the still air, and for a moment he paused, listening, not to the fence, but to everything beyond it. The land lay quiet, open, unchanged, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared, like something unseen stood just beyond reach, not watching anymore, but present in a way that did not need to be proven. He set the post deeper into the ground, pressing his boot against the base until it held firm, then stepped back, wiping his hands against his pants. The simple act of repair grounding him in something real, something he could shape with effort and time. He moved to the next break, repeating the motion, each step building a rhythm that settled into his chest, and with it came a clarity he had not expected, the kind that does not arrive with answers, but with a quiet understanding that the question itself has changed. Back at the house, Nayeli moved through the space with a different kind of rhythm, one that did not come from routine, but from listening. She traced her fingers along the edges of the table, the window frame, the worn boards beneath her feet, not cleaning, not claiming, simply acknowledging what was there. As if learning the language of the place one surface at a time, she paused beneath the pendant again, looking up at it, the turquoise stone now still, no longer catching light with urgency, but holding it in a softer way, like a memory that had settled. She did not reach for it this time. She only stood beneath it, breathing slowly, as if aligning herself with something that had already been set in motion. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distant sage. And for a moment, her eyes moved toward the horizon, not searching, just aware. Elias finished the last of the repairs and straightened, resting his hands on his hips as he looked along the line of fence. It was not perfect, but it would hold, and that was enough for now. He turned back toward the house, the walk slower this time, not from fatigue, but from the way his thoughts had settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be pushed or solved. As he approached, he saw her, standing in the doorway, the light behind her soft now, the sharp edges of morning replaced by something warmer, steadier. He stopped a few feet away, not out of distance, but out of habit, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the silence between them no longer a question, but a space that held what had already been decided. "The fence will hold," he said, his voice carrying that same grounded tone. Naeli nodded. "For now," she replied, and there was no doubt in her words, only acknowledgement. Elias stepped onto the porch, the wood familiar under his boots, but the meaning behind it different now. He leaned lightly against the post, glancing out over the land once more. "I have lived alone a long time," he said, not looking at her as he spoke. "Long enough to forget what it means to share a place with someone." Naeli listened, her expression unchanged, but her presence steady. "And now you remember," she said. Elias let out a slow breath, something close to agreement. "In it, I am starting to," he replied, then turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze again. "It is not simple," he added. Naeli inclined her head just slightly. "It is not meant to be," she answered, the words settling easily, without. "Wait." Elias pushed himself off the post, stepping inside again, the house no longer feeling like a place he had to fill, but one that was already holding something of its own. He moved toward the table, pausing as he noticed something different, not in the structure, not in the objects, but in the way the light moved across the surface, softer, less harsh, as if the room itself had shifted to accommodate something new. Naeli stepped in after him, her movements quiet, unforced. She stopped beside the table, her hand resting lightly against it once more, mirroring the position she had taken earlier, but now it felt less like a moment and more like a pattern forming. Elias watched that for a second, then nodded slightly to himself, as if confirming something he had not yet spoken aloud. Outside, the wind moved through the grass again, but this time it carried no tension, no sense of waiting, just movement, natural and unburdened. The presence that had once followed him seemed to have settled into the land itself, no longer pressing forward, no longer demanding attention, just part of the world as it was. And in that quiet shift, Elias understood something he had not been able to put into words before. This was not about being given something, not about ownership or obligation. It was about what remained after a choice was made, what grew in the space left behind. He reached for the chair, pulling it slightly away from the table, not offering it directly, not turning it into something formal, just making the space exist. And then he stepped back, giving it room. Naeli looked at the chair, then at him, and though her expression did not change, there was a subtle recognition in her eyes, not of the object, but of the meaning behind it. She did not sit right away. Instead, she let the moment linger, letting the choice exist before acting on it. And in that pause, the house held still. The land outside stretched quietly under the afternoon light, and somewhere, beyond what could be seen, the world continued on, unchanged and yet not the same. Because in a place that had once been marked by silence, something else had begun to take root, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the quiet, deliberate way that only comes when two paths choose, without force, without demand, to continue forward side by side. The afternoon settled into the kind of quiet that did not ask for attention. It simply existed, stretching across the land in long shadows and soft light. And inside the house, the air carried that same stillness, but it was no longer empty. It held something shaped by presence, by choice, by the quiet understanding that had taken root without needing to be spoken again. Elias stood near the table, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair he had pulled out, not offering it again, not insisting, just leaving it there as something that existed because he had made space for it. Naeli remained where she was, her gaze moving from the chair to him and then to the window, as if measuring not the object, but the moment itself, the way it unfolded without force, without expectation, and then, without hesitation, she stepped forward and sat, her movement smooth, unhurried, the wood of the chair creaking softly beneath her weight. A small sound, but one that carried further than it should have, because it marked something simple and undeniable. She had chosen to stay in a way that could be seen. Elias watched that for a brief moment, then nodded once, not in approval, not in acknowledgement, but in quiet recognition. He moved toward the window again, pushing it open a little wider, letting more of the outside air drift in, the scent of dry grass and sun warming the room. "There is not much here yet," he said, his voice low, steady, "but it will come together." Naeli rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, following its lines as if reading something written there. "It already has," she replied, and the words settled into the room with a calm certainty that did not need explanation. Elias glanced at her, then back out across the land, considering that, not dismissing it, just letting it exist beside his own understanding. "We will need supplies," he added after a moment, returning to something practical, something he could plan. "Tools, wood, maybe some seed if the soil holds." Naeli nodded. "The soil will hold," she said, and there was no doubt in it. Only knowledge. Elias shifted his weight slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he looked toward the stretch of land near the well. "You sound certain," he said, and Naeli turned her gaze toward the same direction. "Some things do not forget how to grow," she answered. Elias let out a quiet breath, something in that answer settling deeper than he expected. He stepped away from the window, crossing the room slowly, his movements no longer guided by habit alone, but by something that felt closer to intention. He stopped near the doorway, looking up once more at the pendant, the turquoise stone now still, almost blending into the quiet of the house, and yet it remained, a marker, a reminder, not of what had been forced, but of what had been chosen. "That agreement they spoke of," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful now. "It was never about land, was it?" Naeli followed his gaze to the pendant, then back to him. "No," she replied. "It was about whether two people could stand in the same place without taking from each other." Elias nodded slowly, the simplicity of it cutting through everything that had come before. "And if they can?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a continuation. Naeli's expression softened just slightly. "Then something new is allowed to exist," she said, the words quiet, but carrying a weight that did not need to be raised to be heard. Elias looked around the room again. At the table, the chair now occupied, the open window, the light moving across the floor in long, steady lines. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that land, he did not see emptiness waiting to be filled. He saw something already forming, something that did not belong to him alone. And that realization did not unsettle him. It steadied him. He stepped back outside, onto the porch, the late afternoon sun casting a warmer glow across the yard, the shadows stretching longer now, softer, the fence line he had repaired standing straight in the distance, holding as it should. He rested his hands lightly on the railing, looking out, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. Naeli remained inside for a moment, then rose from the chair, her movement as quiet as before. She walked toward the doorway, stopping just behind him, not beside, not in front, just present, the distance between them now defined not by space, but by choice. Elias did not turn, but he was aware of her, the same way he had been aware of the land earlier, not as something separate, but as something that now belonged within the same understanding. The wind moved across the open ground again, carrying no tension, no weight, just movement, natural and unforced. And in that movement, something became clear in a way that did not need to be spoken. The presence that had once followed him, that had watched, that had waited, was no longer standing at the edge of the moment. It had stepped back entirely, leaving only what remained between two people who had chosen, without demand, without pressure, to stand where they were and continue forward, not because they had to, but because they had decided to. And in that quiet, in that steady, unremarkable stretch of time, something more enduring than any agreement had taken shape, something that would not announce itself loudly, would not draw attention, but would remain, in the way the land remains, patient, constant, and always ready to reveal what a man becomes when he is given the chance to choose. The light began to soften as the day leaned toward evening, stretching long shadows across the land that now felt less like something to endure and more like something to stand within. And Elias remained on the porch, his hands resting lightly on the railing, not gripping it, not leaning heavily, just present. The way a man stands when he no longer feels the need to brace against what might come next. The wind moved across the grass in slow, steady waves, and for a moment, it carried a faint sound, not a voice, not a call, just a shift in the air that made him lift his head slightly, listening without knowing exactly what he was listening for. Behind him, Naeli stepped forward, her movement quiet as always, but now it carried something new, Not distance, not observation, but participation. She came to stand beside him, not behind, not apart, but aligned in a way that did not need to be marked or explained. And together they looked out over the land, not searching, not expecting, just seeing. The fence line held firm where he had repaired it. The well sat low in its shallow dip. The house stood steady behind them, no longer just shelter, but something closer to a place that could hold more than one life without asking either to give something up. The light changes early here, Elias said after a moment, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Naeli nodded. The land prepares before the night comes, she replied, and the words settled in a way that felt both simple and layered. Elias let out a quiet breath, something in that answer staying with him. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the path that led back to town. The dust still visible where his horse had ridden earlier, but now it had begun to settle, the marks fading, blending back into the ground as if they had never been there. They will talk, he said, not as a concern, not as a warning, just an acknowledgement of what men do when they do not understand something. Naeli did not look toward the road. She kept her gaze on the horizon. They always do, she answered. Elias nodded once. And they will come, he added. The words steady, not tense. Naeli's expression did not change. Yes, she said, but not for the reason they think. Elias turned his head slightly, studying her for a moment. And what reason is that? He asked. Naeli's eyes shifted just enough to meet his. To see if what they heard is true, she said. Elias let that settle, then gave a small nod. Then they will see, he replied, and there was no need to explain what he meant, because it was already clear in the way he stood, in the way he had chosen, in the quiet space that now existed between them without tension or demand. The sun dipped lower, the light turning warmer, casting a glow across the land that softened every edge, the kind of light that made even the roughest ground look like it held something worth keeping. Elias pushed himself lightly off the railing, stepping down from the porch, his boots pressing into the dirt with a steady rhythm. He walked a few steps out into the yard, then stopped, turning back slightly, not fully, just enough to glance at Naeli. There is something I should say, he said, his voice calm, grounded in that same quiet certainty he had found throughout the day. Naeli stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the porch, her attention fully on him. Elias held her gaze for a moment, then spoke. What was given, I will not accept as something owned. The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. Naeli listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly. And what is chosen, he continued, I will not take lightly, he added, his tone unchanged, steady, clear, the kind of statement that does not ask for agreement, only understanding. Naeli inclined her head slightly, a gesture that held more meaning now than it would have that morning. Then you understand what matters, she said. Elias gave a small nod, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from acceptance of what cannot be undone once seen clearly. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the last warmth of the day across the open land. And in that movement, something shifted once more, not in the world, but in the way it was felt. The presence that had once lingered at the edge of every moment was gone now. Not hidden, not waiting, simply no longer needed, because what it had come to witness had already been revealed, not in words, not in actions that could be pointed to, but in the quiet, steady way a man had chosen not to take what was placed before him, and instead allowed something else to exist in its place, something that did not belong to him, but was still his to protect. The light faded slowly, the sky deepening into shades of gold and blue, and the land settled into evening, not with finality, but with a calm that spoke of continuity, of days that would follow, of work that would be done, of choices that would continue to shape what this place would become. And as Elias stood there, no longer alone, no longer defined by the silence he had once sought, he understood something that did not need to be said aloud, that out here, in a place where most things are taken by force or lost to time, the rarest thing a man can do is choose not to take, and in doing so, become something the land itself recognizes, not as owner, not as master, but as someone who belongs without ever needing to claim it. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the hills, leaving the land wrapped in that deep, steady calm that comes just before night settles in, and Elias stood where he was, not moving, not reaching for anything, just letting the quiet stretch out around him without resistance. The kind of quiet he had once chased across miles of empty ground now felt different. It did not isolate him. It included him, and that difference settled somewhere deeper than thought. Behind him, Nayeli stepped off the porch, her feet touching the earth with a softness that carried intention, not hesitation. She came to stand beside him again, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to live. The sky above them shifted into deeper shades, the first hint of stars pressing through the fading light, and with it came a stillness that did not belong to absence, but to completion, not an ending, but a point where something had been set in place and no longer needed to be questioned. Elias drew in a slow breath, the air cooler now, carrying that faint scent of night settling into the land. They will come. Tomorrow, he said, not as a prediction, but as something already decided. Nayeli did not turn, her gaze still resting on the horizon. Yes, she answered. Elias nodded once, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked toward the distant path. And they will expect something, he added. Nayeli's expression remained calm. They will expect you to act as other men would, she said, and there was no judgment in it, only truth. Elias let out a quiet breath, something in his chest easing as the words settled. Then they will be disappointed, he replied, and the way he said it held no pride, no defiance, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be proven. Nayeli turned her head slightly, looking at him now, not measuring, not testing, simply seeing, and in that look, there was something that had not been there before, not at the beginning, not even earlier that day, something that did not come from tradition or expectation, but from the quiet recognition of a man who had chosen something difficult without needing to be told. The wind moved gently across the land, softer now, carrying no weight, no sense of watching, just movement that belonged to the world as it was. Elias shifted his stance slightly, his boots pressing into the earth with a steadiness that matched the way he held himself. I spent a long time thinking that being alone meant being free, he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Nayeli listened, her presence steady. But I was wrong. He continued, not looking at her, but not avoiding her either. It just meant I never had to choose anything that mattered. The words hung there, simple, but carrying the full weight of years that had led him to this moment. Nayeli's gaze softened just slightly, not in pity, not in agreement, but in understanding. Now you do, she said. Elias nodded, the motion small, but firm. Yes, he replied. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It held that shared understanding, that quiet acceptance of what had been spoken without needing to repeat it. The stars grew brighter above them, one by one, filling the sky with a quiet clarity that did not demand attention, but offered it freely to anyone willing to look. Elias lifted his eyes for a moment, taking it in, then lowered them again, his focus returning to the land in front of him, to the house behind him, to the woman standing beside him, all of it now part of something he had not expected, but no longer resisted. We will need to be ready, he said after a while. Nayeli nodded. We are, she answered, and the certainty in her voice was not about preparation, not about defense. It was about something deeper, something that had already been set in place by the choices made that day. Elias let that settle, then gave a small nod, accepting it not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough. He turned slightly toward the house, taking a step back toward the porch, not to retreat, but to continue. Nayeli followed without hesitation, her movement aligning with his in a way that did not need to be coordinated. It simply happened. They stepped inside together, the house now holding the quiet of evening in a way that felt natural. The table, the chair, the open window, all of it unchanged in form, but different in meaning. Elias reached for the lantern, lighting it with a steady hand, the flame catching slowly, then holding, casting a warm glow across the room, softening the edges, making the space feel less like something temporary and more like something that would remain. Nayeli moved toward the table, her hand resting there once more, not out of habit, but because it had become a place where something real had begun. Elias set the lantern down, the light flickering gently, then steadied, And for a moment, they stood in that shared glow, not speaking, not needing to, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in quieter ways. Outside, the night settled fully over the land, the last trace of daylight gone, replaced by a calm that did not press, did not demand, it simply existed. And in that calm, something remained, not the presence that had once followed, not the weight of expectation, but the simple, steady truth of two people who had chosen, without force, without obligation, to stand where they were and let what came next be shaped not by what was given, but by what they would continue to choose. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came the way it always had on that land, slow, quiet, light stretching across the horizon before the sun ever showed itself. And Elias was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed frame, boots on, hands resting loosely against his knees, not tense, not waiting, just present, the kind of stillness that comes when a man no longer runs ahead of what the day might bring. The lantern had burned low during the night, its glow now faint, but enough to mark the shape of the room, enough to remind him that he was not alone in it. Nayeli stood near the window, her silhouette outlined by the early light, her posture unchanged, calm, steady, as if she had been there long before the sun began to rise. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence between them was no longer a space to fill. It was something that held what had already been decided. Outside, the first sound came, not loud, not sudden, just the distant rhythm of hooves against dry ground, steady, measured, more than one. Elias lifted his head slightly, not reacting with surprise, not reaching for anything, just listening. Nayeli did not turn toward the sound. She did not need to. "They are here," she said quietly, and Elias nodded once, pushing himself to his feet in a single smooth motion, the movement grounded, unhurried. He crossed the room, stepping out onto the porch as the sun finally broke over the hills, casting a long line of light across the yard. And there they were, riders, not many, not a force, but enough to be seen clearly, enough to carry the weight of a question. They approached without urgency, their horses slowing as they reached the fence line, stopping just beyond it, not crossing, not claiming, just present. Elias stepped down from the porch, walking forward a few paces, not to meet them halfway, not to close the distance, just enough to stand where he could be seen without standing behind anything. Nayeli remained on the porch, not hidden, not distant, simply there, visible in the doorway, the same place she had stood the morning before, but now everything about that moment was different. The riders sat still for a long second, their eyes moving from Elias to Nayeli and back again, not searching, not judging, just observing. The kind of observation that carries history without needing to speak it. One of them shifted slightly in the saddle, an older man, his hair marked by time, his posture straight despite the years. He inclined his head once, a gesture small but deliberate. Elias returned it, not out of habit, but because it felt right. The older man spoke, his voice carrying across the space between them, not loud, but clear. "We heard what was said." Elias did not respond immediately. He let the words settle, not weighing them, just acknowledging them. Then he answered, his voice steady, the same tone he had carried since the moment he stepped onto that land. "You heard what was chosen." The words moved through the air and held there, simple, direct, without challenge, without defense. The older man studied him for a moment. Then his gaze shifted to Nayeli, and something passed between them that did not need translation, something understood without words. Nayeli stepped forward then, just one step, enough to stand fully in the light, her presence clear, unhidden, and for a moment, everything stilled. The wind, the horses, the land itself seemed to pause, not out of tension, but out of recognition. The older man inclined his head again, this time slightly deeper, not submission, not concession, but acknowledgement. Then he looked back to Elias. "Then the agreement is fulfilled," he said, and the way he spoke those words carried no weight of transaction, no sense of ownership, only completion. Elias nodded once, not as acceptance, not as agreement, but as understanding. The riders remained for a moment longer. Then, without another word, they turned their horses, the movement smooth, deliberate, no rush, no need to linger, and they rode away the same way they had come, leaving nothing behind but the faint imprint of hooves that would fade with time. Elias stood there, watching until they disappeared beyond the rise, and when they were gone, he let out a slow breath. Not relief, not release, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had ended without needing to be forced to its conclusion. He turned back toward the house, toward the porch where Nayeli still stood, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. No words passed between them, none were needed, because what had been tested had already been answered. Elias stepped back onto the porch, moving past her into the house. The morning light now filling the room fully. No shadows left to hide in, no corners left uncertain. He reached for the table, resting his hand against it lightly, grounding himself in something real, something simple. Nayeli followed, her movement quiet as always. She stopped beside him, her presence no longer something that needed to be understood, only something that existed. And in that stillness, in that quiet space where nothing more needed to be proven, something remained, not the agreement, not the expectation, but the choice, steady, unspoken, and stronger than anything that had come before it. Outside, the land stretched out under the rising sun, unchanged, enduring, and somewhere within it, something had shifted, not in a way that could be seen or measured, but in the way it would remember, because out here, where most men take what they can and leave the rest to fade, the rarest thing is not strength, not power, but the quiet decision to stand still and let something else remain. And that is the kind of thing the land never forgets.